But otherwise, we are here, ladies and gentlemen, for one major issue that I want to put on the table, say. The issue is that the Republic of Zimbabwe has decided to amend the Constitution. Amendment number 2 of the Constitution of the Republic was gazetted towards the end of the year last year and re-gazetted again beginning of the year this year. And 27 clauses are going to be amended by are proposed to be amended. And what is the Constitution? Because we need to understand if we are going to discuss these amendments. The Constitution that we currently have, I call it the birth certificate of the modern society of Zimbabwe. Because this is a constitution that was adopted in 2013, the 22nd of March, after having been voted through a referendum by 95.4% of the population. It means we have a document in the country that is generally agreed by the peoples of Zimbabwe. And this is the document that is being amended, or a proposal to amend is being made to a document that is generally accepted by the people of Zimbabwe. And it is a document that was accepted by people across all party lines, political lines, religious lines, ethnic lines, class lines. Everybody came together and said, we want this constitution. When people were voting on that day, it didn't matter whether you were a member of the opposition or a member of the ruling party or a non-partisan person. It didn't matter. We all agreed as a people of Zimbabwe. But before the document is even given the feet to walk and jump, the wings to fly, the document is now being amended. And we are putting it on the table to the leadership, the scholars, civic society, to say, look, what are the issues here? Can we unpack these issues? Can we unpack this document? Is it necessary to amend it? These are the questions that are going to be put on the table. And by the end of the day, we need a shared understanding of the document. Of course, there are 27 clauses, but there are key clauses. Key clauses around the judiciary, around parliament, around women and youth, around devolution, and others. Those are key issues that are going to be put on the table. And by the end of the day, we would want those that are coming from the civic society to go out there and begin to engage. I know that various initiatives are being put in place in order to enable civic society to work together collectively and have a kind of coordinated response to some of the issues. But this meeting is meant to bring out a shared understanding. We may not agree, but a shared understanding of the key issues that are contained in those clauses.
About mid-80s, and in my first life, I was Shona. In my second life, I'm Ndebele. You can ask me why and what happened in the process when you got time. During that time, when I got here, I started looking at and listening to people talk about Gokurahundi. But what also gripped the people at that point was other people like Professor Ngube, Welshman, and John Makumbe, and Maduku, as they started talking about the need for a constitution. And I didn't quite understand what they were talking about until it was made very clear to us and to me that what we actually had was a ceasefire document that was agreed in Lancaster without any consultation between, in actual fact, 2, if not 3 political parties: ZAPU, ZANU, and the Rhodesian Front. So the document was basically how to bring about a change in Zimbabwe. And so that document did not cover everything else that a country needed to be able to move forward. And so it became very clear that we needed a constitution for Zimbabwe. And so the country, at that point, the people were not very sure of what needed to be done. But with time, we began to see people walking about, people talking to other people, and in no time, beginning of the 90s, an organization was formed, and it was entitled National Constitutional Assembly, NCA. And this became very powerful. It had representatives almost in every province, everywhere, including the rural areas. And so Maduku became the key person because of his understanding and conviction as well, by virtue of having been to part of the law department at UZ. And with that in mind, it became very clear. It's actually surprising that, or rather not surprising that, it is out of the NCA that the current MDC came from. It is because of the mobilization, the momentum, the grassroots work that was done by people that wanted a new constitution had done. And as a result, people began to talk about the new constitution. The country was seized with this idea, which was really a pipe dream. A dream that people did not know of and not know what it meant. But nevertheless, it became very clear that without that, we were not going to be able to move forward as a nation. And as a result, the MDC was formed very late in the 90s, and there was a separation between MDC and NCA. MDC became a political party, but the NCA continued with that role. And this became a very big issue. Others decided we needed to concentrate on this, whereas others decided they also needed to wrestle power from the powers that be. And so there were two different agendas, where MDC was talking about them being taking power from ZANU-PF, whereas NCA continued to talk about the need for a new constitution in the country. And some of us then joined in at that point, especially to talk about the NCA and the new constitution. It took 33 years for Zimbabweans to come up with their own constitution. We used the ceasefire agreement. The role of civic society cannot be downplayed as a basis for opposition voice of dissent. In many progressive countries, the government sponsors civic society activity and work in order to keep it strong and viable. Without which, without civic society, there is no basis for opposition political ideas. It is not the political party itself that matters. What actually matters is the civic society, because the civic society is the bedrock of opposition and free, creative ideas. And that is, to me, one of the key aspects in terms of the historical aspect of our Constitution, that it was these ordinary people that actually came up with the ideas, whilst others are seized with issues of power. The civic society is seized with issues that affect the day-to-day life of every individual. Very, very critical for us to be able to make that differentiation. And as we probably fast track because of time, in about 2000, when MDC started, and there was a referendum, and obviously the referendum was whether we should have a new constitution or not. That whole idea was derailed by MDC because it became basically the battle of two political parties, ZANU-PF or MDC. And basically, part of the crisis was that the people that most of us actually trusted and depended on was Jonathan Moyo. And it is at that point that Jonathan Moyo crossed over to ZANU-PF. And that is one of the key reasons why the majority of people said no. And not only that, it became very clear that people of Zimbabwe, whilst they were not interested in political parties, but they did not want a politically driven process at that point. The reason being that we felt that the government was doing this in order to entrench themselves in power, and there was not going to be a proper process that will enhance the participation of civic society and every Zimbabwean into the constitutional making process. So we did not want that. So eventually, it became very clear in 2006, 2007. I was very fortunate, I thank God, that at that point I was a member of the Zimbabwe Christian Alliance, and we brought political parties and civic societies together under what was known as the Save Zimbabwe campaign. Some of you who are older would remember. And I happened to be the chairperson of the secretariat, and I was chairing the political parties and civic society. We met at the hotel, the main hotel in Harare, whatever it's called. What is it called, the big one? The HICC there, in the ground outside. ZANU-PF was meant to be there, they didn't come. The two MDC parties came. That's where, for the first time, Morgan Tsvangirai was able to speak to Mtambara face to face, and they shook hands for the first time. Out of that, we decided to bring the political parties and civic society together, and we decided to have a prayer meeting at Zimbabwe grounds in Highfield, where Morgan Tsvangirai, Maduku, and many others were butchered by the security forces. The violence spread all over the place. That's when SADC intervened because of the violence. It was unacceptable. SADC intervened, and they asked Mbeki, and so the global agreement, GNU, came into place. Part of the problem with that was that the brief was that political parties had to be involved and not civic society or churches. So they engaged the three political parties. I didn't want to connect it. It's okay. Thank you. So the political parties were not involved, and as a result, it became problematic to most of us. But nevertheless, it brought about the GNU. And so part of the decision that was already made was such that one of the objectives of the GNU is that they needed to come up with a new constitution. It was one of the objectives of the GNU. And in actual fact, in my opinion, it was one of the only deliverable that they were able to make. That was the only deliverable they were able to make. And they delivered. Even though, unfortunately, it was politically driven and civic society was not involved, except that we were consulted in many ways. They had symposium, they had meetings all over the place where they consulted. So rather than be the ones who are driving it, we were only consulted. But at the end of the day, I think a very, very, very good document came about or resulted from that. This was made out of the three political parties, ZANU-PF, MDC, Tsvangirai, and MDC, I can't remember whatever it was called. And so they delivered. The COPAC drove the whole process, and we came up with the current constitution. And it is unfortunate that at this point we have been asked to amend that constitution. The problem is because it has not seen daylight. It has not yet been implemented. How do you amend a document which has not even been implemented? And that's how our current constitution came about. And we thank God for that.
My title of presentation is The Rationale for Amending the Constitution Before the Alignment of Laws. If it's not working, maybe let me just use. Okay. So, by way of the layout of my presentation, I'll start with the problem. The problem is the sitting ZANU-PF government has made plans to amend the constitution. And that's the problem, to amend the constitution before the alignment of laws. There is a problem there. And therefore my presentation seeks to answer the why part. Why has ZANU-PF government decided to amend the constitution before the alignment of the laws? So when we want to understand that, we need to establish the rationale or the reasons behind ZANU-PF's quest for amendments. And the reasons are best explained within about 4 or 5 governance and political science conceptual frameworks. In political science and governance studies, you have interacted with such terms as authoritarianism and dictatorship. You have interacted with such terms as dictatorship versus democracy. You also come through 2 interesting terms that really featured prominently in Prof. Moyo's democracy paper, the de jure and the de facto kind of like leadership and party system. But I'm more inclined to talk about the rule of law and rule by law aspect as we seek to understand the reasons behind the government or the party's quest to amend the constitution. When we are talking of the rule of law and rule by law, the rule of law is so much premised on the respect for the constitution. The respect for the constitution, whereby those in authority do stick to what is in the constitution. So that's where we are, on the rule of law versus rule by law. And in this presentation, the reasons why the ZANU-PF government has decided to amend the constitution is entrenched in the rule by law approach. This is when authorities play around the instruments of the law in order to assert their authority or leadership over a nation. And this presentation will trace the historicity of ZANU-PF government in its quest for power. The reason why, the answer is simple, my presentation is very simple. The reason why the government wants, the ruling party wants to amend the constitution is the insatiable power appetite, which can be traced from history to the contemporary. That unfulfilled, unmet quest or appetite for power. Those that are familiar with history, I don't know whether Dr. Motsi would understand. You will trace this desire or this quest for power from the conception of ZANU-PF in 1963. ZANU history. The first one to be formed was ZAPU. And ZANU came. How ZANU came is as a result of the quest for power. Then those that are really familiar with history will know of what is called Zimbabwe People's Liberation Army, sort of like a combination of ZIPRA and ZANLA. What led to its death is this quest for power. Because these military wings had decided under Zinasi Machingura to come together and fight. And there was that aspect of togetherness and unity, equality, inclusivity. But because of the quest for power, ZIPA died just soon after 1976. Look at the National Longest House negotiations, elections, and 1980 government. The period that came after the coming in of ZANU-PF leadership in 1980. The ZANU-PF leadership has always been hunting and looking for power. So when we want to understand the amendments, we also need to take into consideration this history. You look at the history of elections, how the ZANU-PF government has always wanted to remain in power. The rules, the laws that they stick to when it comes to elections, that is under the political economy of elections. When we talk of the free, fair credibility of elections, you look at how ZANU-PF project itself or how ZANU-PF structure the system of elections. And also, you need to understand that between 1980 and 2008, this government has been so much concerned with developing and cementing the security system, capturing key governance institutions. This is very key, capturing key governance institutions. Because if you look at the proposed amendments, it is targeted at strategic instruments of power or apparatus of power. When you look at the proposed judicial amendments that probably some other presenters are going to talk about, these are key in terms of the consolidation of power. And Dr. Motsi has talked about the constitutional making process, but I would have wanted him maybe to highlight how ZANU-PF behaved during the constitutional making process of 1998.
You didn't ask the question.
I thought you were going to address that one. Then you look at the GNU era, and we are privileged to have Doc Moyo, who was part and parcel of the government of the day, the GNU. Again, the struggle for control of key ministries is also showing us that this government always has wanted to control strategic departments or institutions, staffing. And there was an interesting issue that boggled my mind during the GNU era. There were packed issues, which ZANU-PF said these ones are non-negotiable, we cannot talk about. And they said these are packed in the GNU document. This just shows how the ZANU-PF government has always wanted to control and to get into power and to maintain and consolidate its power. And also during that GNU era, you will find that if you privately ask Dr. Jimon, he will tell you that where he was working in the Para-State House Ministry, State Enterprises, there was a bit of staffing by ZANU-PF, whereby the ex-soldiers, the police people, the security people would always be planted to make sure that there is no freedom of those that would have been given, especially from the opposition. There were judges, ex-judges, ex-military people, ex-soldiers that were staffed there because of ZANU-PF's quest for power. So you then understand that in the 2013 constitution, the COPAC period, ZANU-PF sort of like lost its grip on power. And like in the opening remarks, 95% of the population voted for that document. But to be honest and to be true, ZANU-PF was not happy with that consultative process, that national outlook. Yes, it wasn't a perfect document. And like what Doc said, it is the birth certificate, which needed to be improved in terms of the approach used. But ZANU-PF authorities were never in agreement total with the document that came or that saw the light of day in 2013. So the period after 2013, if you remember, ZANU-PF was so eager to get into elections in 2013 so that they would then revert back to the pre-GNU era. So this is what they have done after that. It's about the regaining of power post the 2013 constitutional amendment, constitutional outreach, and the COPAC. The focus now after 2013 by ZANU-PF was on both national and internal power struggles. You will find then that the rising voice of discontent within ZANU-PF is also informing the so-called amendments. When you look at the running mate clause and proposed amendments, it is meant to contain the ZANU-PF internal political dynamics. The idea of reforming the judicial element is meant again to capture the judicial institution, the judiciary, which is part of government's institutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, the rationale behind the amendment of the Constitution is power seeking, power retention by the ZANU-PF government. Thank you, Siabo. Attend.
I know that it has been introduced and prefaced and so forth, and that is very useful. It's very difficult, though, to talk about this amendment without talking about it, perhaps, in broad terms, and without talking about the whole notion of amendment of a constitution. I'd like to say at the onset that there is nothing wrong with amending a constitution. The constitution itself provides for a mechanism in terms of which you can amend a constitution. And the constitution, firstly, when it comes to certain provisions, like the Declaration of Rights, it states very clearly that if you want to amend the Declaration of Rights, what you must do is that you must call a referendum. And the whole notion of a referendum, I think, is important to all of us in this room. Because remember, it is one of the things that we had to fight for as civic society, as political parties, as Zimbabweans. But those who were in civil society, going back to the formation of the NCA, coming up to now, will know that we had to fight for these referendums. We had to fight for independent commissions. Because remember, prior either to referendums, commissions would be called by the president, formed, and the reports would never be publicized. That was one of the issues. The second issue was consulting the public, having referendums. And so if you summarize it, you will see that what we've really had a problem with in Zimbabwe is the culture of consulting the public. Or maybe, to put it in a different way, should our leaders think that our opinions matter, in terms of the leadership style or the ethos we want to adopt in Zimbabwe, do the opinions of the public matter? We know that the public, obviously, they will elect you, and once you're elected, you're a leader. And if you're a leader, you must execute, you must make decisions. But in making those decisions, do they take into account what the public, the people you are leading, think? Do they have periods where they can intervene by giving you a mandate? So the first mandate, obviously, is an election. But in between, are there not some weighty issues that are so important that they cannot be changed? In fact, when when members of the public make a constitution, do they not have a right to reserve for themselves certain things that only they can change? Because if we are saying power comes from the people, we are saying that there are certain things. Because we've been given this, if I'm a president, I've been given the mandate by the people. I've been given the mandate by the people via the Constitution. I want us to understand this. It's a mandate I have from the people via the Constitution. It is not the only theory to a state or to leadership of a state that exists. But in Zimbabwe, we have accepted it. Because we passed the Constitution that makes public accountability at the prime. And when I came in, the Reverend Dr. Mods was going on about the importance of public participation in the constitution-making process. So I agree that that is important. It was one of the key demands. But I also want to say that public participation in the constitutional-making process also needs to perhaps to be unpacked. Because if my neighbors are having a wedding, they may ask me or they may ask my daughter to come and participate by being a bridesmaid. She's participating. You know, you can participate in something that's not yours. I don't know whether, if I'm getting married and it's my wedding, of course I do participate in the wedding. But am I really a participant? In the sense that I'm an aloof. So when we use the term participate here, I think it has another meaning. Because the public shouldn't really participate. Yeah. They are making the bloody thing. Excuse my language. They are making the Constitution. It's theirs. And so, in making that Constitution, do they not have a right to reserve for themselves certain things? So, for example, they'll say, if you want to amend the Bill of Rights, we reserve this for ourselves. You must come back to us so that we can ultimately decide what must happen. Did you see my logic? So if the public have reserved for themselves certain things, like amending the Declaration of Rights, would it be proper, just using our, just logic and common sense, would it then be proper? I've been told you can't amend this before you come back to me. Would it be proper for me to then amend it and say, I don't like that provision, I'm changing it? You cannot change it because you have to go back to the people. They gave you a mandate. There are other things that they also did not reserve per se, like, for example, well, let's talk about the 2/3 majority. There are certain things that they said, look, if you want to amend the Constitution, well, make sure that it's done by a 2/3 majority. And I want to come and also blame the electorate, because I want to come back to ourselves and see what blame we also have. Because we all share in this problem sometimes. They say some things cannot be changed unless there's a 2/3 majority. And so the problem then becomes that when you, so it means every five, when you are saying that as members of the public, you're saying every 5 years we're going to give our leaders a fresh mandate. And we think that the leaders that we've given a fresh mandate are able to make good decisions for us. And we think that if there's 2/3 majority, we think their decisions are safe. But then in an election, you then go ahead to give political parties a 2/3 majority willy-nilly. Anyone who's moving, do you want a 2/3 majority? There. Do you want 2/3 majority? You're just dishing it out. And then that 2/3 majority comes back to bite you. Whose fault is it? I think it's a good starting point, which we can convert into a lesson. To say that perhaps it is not good for one political party to have 2/3 majority. Because our constitution also recognizes the principle of multi-partyism. We have a plural system of political parties. But we are not using it because we really do not consider those kind of things. So when we promote participation of all political parties and ensure that 2/3 majority, can only be won in certain key moments, when you think there is something that is of a broad consensus that you want to give this government to go and change. But outside those moments, perhaps we need to promote a culture where it is very difficult to achieve that 2/3 majority. And I can tell you that in a proportional representation system, the 2/3 majority is more difficult to obtain than here. Because in this situation, if I in Kulumane win by 2,301 votes, and the other person has 2,300 votes, they say I'm the winner, and I take everything. And if that happens across all the constituencies, I've got my 2/3 majority. But when you compare the figures of people who voted, you may find that only 51% people have voted for me, versus the other 50%. So I'm just pointing out this as maybe perhaps part of the problem always begins with the elections and what transpires in the elections. Hence the reason why we say that the crisis that we are facing in Zimbabwe stems from the question of elections, stems from the question of legitimacy, whether or not you think that the president who is there is legitimate. And I'll tell you something about a party which is not legitimate, or a president who is not legitimate. He is more likely to throttle and muffle the constitution than one who is legitimate. Because remember, a president is elected, in fact, to protect the constitution. That is his chief duty, is to protect the constitution. He is the chief defender of the constitution. And so I move on to the notion that whilst constitutions may be amended, they must not be amended easily. And I always give this example. There is somebody who said that they were talking about a judge making judgments. In making judgments, the judge is not concerned about the weather outside. He will not say, oh, it's raining outside, so I don't think that a ruling that people should not have umbrellas is a good one, so I won't make it. Because we know that on a daily basis, the weather changes every hour. If you're in Cape Town, I think it's every hour. It changes every day. But he is concerned more about the climate of the era. So we expect that when it comes to amendments, we mustn't make those amendments that suit what is happening outside on a day-to-day basis. To say, oh, today the president is short, so we must make a provision that all doors must only be up to 2 meters. Next year we are elect a tall president, we're now changing the prescription for our doors. It can't work that way. But we must consider, I'll give you an example. There may be a shift in what people feel about gender issues. We know that, as we came into 1980, issues of gender were not big. People did not understand them. Issues of human rights, some years ago, were non-issues. I mean, countries did not have declarations of human rights. But as the era turns, there may be certain important issues that also turn with it, that become so important that you may need once in a while to revisit your constitution and say, look, it has become obvious that the trend in this age is this. Let us ensure our constitution has a declaration of rights. You may then amend your constitution to encompass a declaration of rights. These are key issues My suggestion is that this constitution has been amended to take into account or to suit personal issues or narrow interests of political parties, narrow interests of political sections, rather than the broad interests that benefit the entire society. If you look at what cuts through the entire constitution, it is about consolidation of power for the president. It is also about weakening the judiciary, for instance, weakening the Human Rights Commission, weakening even Parliament. There's a clause which says if they want to enter into an agreement with a Chinese company, a private company, they can accumulate as much debt as they want, and they don't have to bring the agreement to Parliament. So they're asking you to say, can we do this without you knowing? So that 20 years from now, you realize that some private Chinese company, owns the entire country. So these are some of the risks that, you get with these kind of amendments. But obviously, the respective presenters will deal with each and every amendment. My task today is simply to deal with one. To explain to you the amendment on the running mate, show you where the amendments are. I hope you all have your constitutions. Show you exactly where the amendments are, how they've been done, what they mean, and then explain to you, demonstrate to you that they've been done in order to serve narrow personal interests, as opposed to the principle of accountability and transparency that cuts through our constitution. And that was the demand of the people who gave us this constitution. So I will begin by going to section 92. It's on page 42 for those who have the constitution. In section 92, you will see that the heading is election of the president and the vice president. So what the amendment has done has been to delete that heading. It's a very brief amendment. It has been to delete that heading and call it the election of the president. That's because the amendment that deals with the amending, abolishing the running mate has basically weakened the power of vice presidents and made sure that they are not elected, but rather they are appointed by the president himself. And so what they've done is they've gone throughout section 92, where it says 2 vice presidents, they've just deleted everything. They've deleted the words "and 2 vice presidents" in subsection 1, and also in subsection 5. They've also deleted subsection 2 and subsection 3. So, which means that the only person who gets elected now is the president himself. If you go to section 92, it was providing for the election of a president and 2 vice presidents. And subsection 2 was saying, every candidate for election as president must nominate 2 persons for elections jointly with him as vice presidents. So he nominates 2 people. So Faye wants to be the president. I want you to tell me whether this is unfair. Faye wants to be the president. He's a candidate. And the law is saying, Faye, you want to be president. Why don't you nominate your friends that you want to help you in this thing? And who will also be the 2 vice presidents that will serve with you? And Faye nominates Latricia, he nominates Chuma there. And then they run together. But the problem is that the public has said, the people who made the constitution, they've said, look, we are tired of this thing of vice presidents who are being appointed here and there, balancing, whatever, unity accord. We are tired of all the noise that accompany this thing. We're also tired of the uncertainty that when you die, we don't know who's going to be the president, there's going to be infighting and all these kind of things. We're tired of that kind of thing. Why don't you tell us, we are the public, we are your masters, we're now telling you, Fire, nominate your 2 people now. And once you nominate them, they will run with you jointly. I want you to note the word jointly there in subsection 2. So first they will be elected, but they will also be elected jointly with you. This is what the current president doesn't like. He doesn't want to be elected jointly with anybody. He wants to be elected by himself. And then after that, he wants to be able to pick people who can serve at his pleasure and people that he can dismiss at his pleasure. So basically, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this amendment taking us back to the pre-2013 constitution. And if you go to the submissions that were made at COPAC, this thing had a question on its own. And the people were very clear that this is what they wanted. So this is an amendment that is running counter to the wishes of the people. Because this is a subject that the people consider. I'm being told I've got 2 minutes. It's a passionate subject. So I want you to consider for yourself whether you think that amendment is fair. Because all that happens is that Section 92 has said these people are no longer elected. And I'll give you another reason. In terms of Section 94, well, Section 94 has been fiddled with as well, just to reflect what I've been saying. To say that in terms of assuming the presidency, Section 94 was saying that these people who have been jointly elected will assume the presidency and the vice presidency respectively at the same time. In fact, there was also a requirement that one of them should be selected as the first president, first vice president, and the other one as the second vice president. If you then, they've added something on the appointment of VPs as subsection 2A under section 94. So it is now the president who appoints these VPs after his election. So I think this is the key difference: appointment versus election. And you have to consider as the people whether this is what you want. This is what is in line with your wishes. And then when it comes to the term of the office as well, I'll skip that. Let's go to succession. Section 101 is another important one. If you look, and note that Section 92 is in the main text of the Constitution. This is what is in the Constitution now. The only reason why we haven't been applying it is because if you go to the sixth schedule, you will find a provision that says that this Section 92 was supposed to kick in 2023. So they suspended, the political parties who negotiated this thing, because the Constitution is a negotiated document. It always is. And it's true what Mfundisi Motsi was saying, that it will always reflect some politics. So ZANU-PF refused to have this thing implemented immediately. They said, no, let's implement it in 2023. I am sure in their calculation they wanted to say, look, Mugabe, this should not apply to Mugabe. So now we are in 2023. And basically this amendment that they want to put in place now is what was in the sixth schedule. The sixth schedule is now coming to the fore, and the main text of the Constitution is being putted out. That is what is happening. So in terms of succession to the president now, that's another key thing, is that if the president died, in terms of the main text of the Constitution as it stands now, applicable from 2023, the first vice president will take over. Automatically, not debate. Because he's been elected by the people, so there should not be any debate. And the second vice president will become the first vice president. And then the new president would appoint the second vice president. And so forth and so forth. So this is again what they didn't want. But as I read this, to me, it's something which makes sense. And the people's thinking seems to be superior to that of those who are proposing the amendment. It's clear, it trusts the people. Now, let me tell you briefly why the current president wants this amendment. I mean, this has been explained by the introductory papers, which gave you the background. It is also in the contributions there. Dr. Gordon Moyo talked about the G7. This constitution now says that if the president should become incapacitated in terms of this amendment, it is the political party of the president which now appoints the vice president. So kuyacebela lokho. Kuyakucebela ukuthi mbanobhala lokho. It's clearly the political party. It wants to retain power. The same group that is controlling cabinet wants to control the constitution and appointments. So this is basic. There's no rocket science to this. It's simply basic. We shouldn't waste a lot of time debating it. It's a bad amendment, which is done because those who are amending it, one, they are afraid of the people. Secondly, they are afraid of parliament. They are afraid of their own political party. This is an amendment done by someone who is afraid, because if you have the 2/3 majority, why are you afraid of some of these clauses that say Parliament will appoint, will conduct hearings, interviews for judges, JSC will do interviews. Why are you afraid of that? Why are you afraid of a provision which says that before you enter into an agreement that gives us a financial burden, you should go through Parliament? When it's your Parliament, it tells you that this is written by someone who's afraid of even his own political party, his own parliamentarians. So we are taking issues to do with personal succession battles or internal succession battles in ZANU-PF, internal power dynamics in our political parties, and we are making them the basis for amending the constitution. So the basis for amending the constitution is not the public good, but is merely, an amendment in order to assuage us or to cover up our biggest fears. This is a Chivenga amendment. It's an amendment to keep Chivenga out of that office. And it's also, by the same token, an amendment by those in the party to ensure that when their turn comes also, they have a say in whom they appoint as vice president. So this guy should not be vice president in 2023, Chivenga. But if the party wants him in after 2023, or if something happens to Mnangagwa, then the party can kick in and bring in their candidate. So in a nutshell, I would say that this is what is contained. I'll entertain questions, but before I do so, people mentioned something about alignment, and it's a topic that I cannot resist commenting about. I want to refer you to section 342 of the Constitution. Alignment is good, and I happen to know that there's been a lot happening in terms of alignment. There's a joint committee there in the departments which is dealing with this, and they've got a massive list of acts that they want to align. In fact, they had begun to do so. If you saw the legislative agenda which was put, it was actually ambitious. They were trying to do that. But this has been one of the contradictions of E.T. Mnangagwa's rule. In the early days of his tenure, he was trying to impress everybody to show that he is willing to comply. But then, you see, this Chivenga thing happened. And he forgot about that agenda and ran with something else. So you will see that the pace is now slow. And in fact, this amendment may be a signal that we are now moving away from implementation, and we are now moving on to entrenching and consolidating our dictatorship. This is what we are seeing. So I expect that there will be less alignment. But again, ourselves as civil society, we've also been to blame on this thing of alignment. We've been crying so much for alignment, because alignment, by its nature, is going to take quite some time, that we've forgotten to insist that they should adhere to the Constitution. I made this presentation to lawyers at the summer school to say, you've forgotten to call upon them to adhere to the Constitution. You've forgotten to take them to court to comply. Because non-alignment of laws does not mean we have no laws. And does not mean that those laws can't be implemented. Go to section 342, which says exercise of functions. It says any functions that you are given in the Constitution as an institution of government should be discharged immediately. You should comply. You should exercise those functions immediately. If you are a local authority and you have certain functions you must do, you cannot come back and say, oh, well, the act has not been amended. You have to interpret that Constitution in order to comply. Exercise those functions. And they are also given the ancillary powers that you ought to have. So even those powers that are not written down, which go with the power that you've been given. You are given the right to exercise them. So aside from this, we must be calling upon these people to exercise their functions. It's no excuse. If you read that, if you go to page 148, the 6th schedule, and look at paragraph 10 there. It says all laws enforced in Zimbabwe will continue to exist, does it not? But subject to the fact that they comply with the constitution. So alignment is automatic there. But of course, in order for us to be able to implement the laws better, there is need for us to undertake this massive drive to change each law to be in accordance with the constitution so that people can read it better, officials can implement better because they're merely reading rather than interpreting. But it does not mean that everything should be at a standstill. And I think it's very criminal for the devolution clause not to have been implemented up to now. It should have been implemented because everything to implement it is there. The text of the constitution is there. It doesn't matter that you think that it's not reasonable, that MPs should be going down. But you should comply. Complainers, you comply. So that when we are now amending, we are amending something that we've seen. We may be amazed, maybe with the wisdom of the people is such that it works. So implement it, and then, so that as we change it, we don't change it in the air, as someone said. So we think that we should be focusing more on implementation rather than on amendment. Amending a constitution should never be a rush. But the last call that I make to you is that there's 90 days in terms of which we can do these kind of workshops, come up with positions, and then campaign. It's important to campaign so that people everywhere, in the rural areas, in townships, in hotels, everywhere, people know what is happening, people know why it is happening, people are able to take positions, so that when the parliamentary committee goes to consult, it does not consult people who have been spoon-fed. Because everyone wants legitimacy. So the people who are making this amendment, they want legitimacy also. So they will need that one of the outcomes of the outreach is that people said, we love the amendment. We think the president should have all the power. So that they can then turn around and say, oh, we have made this amendment and the people loved it so much. It also matters for going forward that as they make, this amendment will be made, I mean, there's no other, there's 2/3 majority. It's an unthinking 2/3 majority because it's X and mass and block. It's whipped. So it will be passed. But it's important to have it on the record that the people said they don't want this kind of thing. Abantu laba babanjiwe babanjwe inkunzi. Amendment yomgunyathi. Angithi? So people should know, because constitutions are made for ages. We have not, killed the constitution. It's going to be amended, not killed. So there's going to be an opportunity when you exercise your mandate in another 5 years, whether in 2023 or whenever. You as the public will have to make a decision. So there's this decision you are making to voice your concerns. There is a subsequent decision, which is the ultimate decision you have, which is an election. You may actually run an election on the basis of fixing what has been destroyed. And it may actually turn out to be one of those elections where you may want a 2/3 majority.
Okay, Honorable.
In order for you to be able to fix what has been destroyed. So for me, this is the way forward. This is the context that I'm giving to you. But I'm pointing out that because Mandla, you want to say that what's important is to make noise now. And if we lose now, then it's over. And I'm saying, no, that can't be true. The power you have as the public is now when the parliament comes to consult. But the ultimate power that you have is in an election. The ultimate mess up that we made is in an election. So it will always come back to the elections. That's why I'm happy somebody put the electoral amendment there. I think it highlights that is the key thing. That is what it goes back to. And the main amendment here concerns the election, or not wanting an election even of your vice presidents. I thank you.